Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today, again, is Randal Baier. Today we'll be discussing books that Rip Rap has received for review. Welcome to Rip Rap, Randy.
Thanks. Great to be here again.
One of the first things I want to talk about is about digital archives. And I didn't realize how significant this was until I was doing some research this week and ran across an article about securing digital image assets in museums and libraries. And then I realized how volatile and vulnerable they are. And it was an article by Beamsley. But the thing was, I always thought of libraries as stable environments where you had these books on shelves and you could always go there and see the same text. You know, you didn't have to worry about it. And that certainly isn't true with the digital environment.
No, it's volatile, isn't it? It's, we have photographs that go back to the turn of the previous century, and some are still intact, kept in places, wonderful archives like the Eastman House in Rochester, New York, and the Library of Congress, and the big universities, specialized photo collectors. But as things are now becoming digitally native and not on film, it's extremely volatile material. And formats change, even converting from previous, film-based materials into digital form takes a lot of planning, and you have to know that down the line that format may become obsolete. So you have to keep it in the most conducive large scale, get every possible bit you can out of that picture or when you take the picture, and keep it in some raw form that will be able to transfer to the next popular format or the next preservation format as things develop, as things come along. Plus, there are so many, I'm sure the article covers, there's so many complex issues just with the technicalities of images, because an image is not an image. An image is a value of storage. Some have many what we call high resolution for print, for eventual print. Some are compressed and have various aspects of compression and loss applied to them. Algorithms that compress them and keep them in a stored format to save space that then will, be uncompressed. And even it's analogous to much of the music we listen to. We listen to music typically in files like MP3 files, which are actually deceptive because there's been high-end sound taken out of those to save space. So it's a highly efficient format, but it actually doesn't have all the information that an original recording might have. But the ear doesn't hear it, but some of the machinery will. So it's really a complex issue.
There's so many issues that I hadn't even thought about. Like you're saying, how do you acquire that image? What process do you use? Where are you going to put that? And how are you going to store it?
And the whole issue of backup, where to keep it. The nature of off-site now. We're in a digital world. So off-site used to mean, like if you look at the negatives from Hollywood, for instance, off-site was actually a mountain storage site. It's safe, cool, limited fluctuation of temperature and things of that nature. Now off-site means, in the cloud, on a server, out of your building, or your particular place, out of your house, so that if your house burns down, it's very practical aspects to protection. But replication, many times, is one of the guiding kind of bits of wisdom.
Another thing I hadn't thought about is how you set up your retrieval when you place that there. if there's any corruption of those terms, or if it's not done properly, it's as good as deleted because it's not accessible. And that just seemed like a huge issue.
Yeah, you literally can't see it, even though it's there, in a sense. I'm sure this has. There are a lot of people working on this in various fields, of course. I mean, and it goes from the common everyday snapshot world to, you know, government security and things that can actually make a difference in the lives of people in terms of, you know, their physical protection and things like that. It's interesting. I mean, if you're talking just photos, you said visual material, but
And audio material too.
It covers the gamut. Yeah.
But what was fascinating when you're talking about MPEG files, you may store it, but then when you retrieve it, you may not be getting the whole file back depending on how you're doing that. But you're losing something.
Yeah.
And for scholars doing research, they're taking this information thinking this is an authentic, complete file, but it's not. And those other elements to it are of huge importance.
Also, the way that you can manipulate images now, because we're really talking about computer information that's a switch, an on or an off, a 1 or a 0. And if you can get control of those in the sense of photographs, these picture elements, pixels, you can discolor them, you can change them. Everything is you know, you can manipulate the original in ways that could either be creative or artistic, or it could be destructive.
Well, and it has to do with the integrity of the information. When we see a book, we know what that is, and it still may have inconsistencies and bias and all that stuff. But with digital file, people processing it can introduce those things, but people accessing it think that it's authentic.
Yeah.
Because it's available, and so they play it or make copies of it.
Or you see it. Yes, you're right. And you're looking at what you think is, for all intents and purposes, the original thing.
It was just shocking to me that digital files are so volatile and so manipulable. It was just mind-blowing that, you know, it's not the book of the old times. It's literally, like I said, an issue of mathematics and logarithms.
The retrieval is an interesting aspect of this because to store films, single snapshots, two-dimensional, you know, pictures versus moving pictures where you're duplicated 30 times a second. So you've got, for one picture, you've got 30, you know, to deal with the film in terms of its moving. So it's enormous amounts of data. But to keep that original is the storage and the preservation aspect of it, and then the retrieval and the sort of daily use, if I can put it that way, is another part of the system. So it's a whole system of creation, storage, preservation, and output, I guess, for the retrieval side of it. And it has to all work together. And I guess by analogy, it was that way in the analog world. But you didn't have thousands of multiples of these things, and also you had a different series of processes. I mean, we used to have storage would be, okay, some famous photographer had taken 20,000 pictures, all those rolls of film, and out of those rolls of film, one picture was the picture that was the, you know, the one famous picture, the printable picture that became part of their artwork, and then copies would be made and whatnot. So now that's it's just multiplied by a large.
And I was thinking,
large amount.
in the past, you had photocopies, and you had micro film.
Right, right.
And that was pretty much it.
And also very but yeah, you're touching on the analogies that come along, and the you know, in any era, in any now, and every 18 months, you know, there's a new kind of game in town. So actually, microfilms, oddly enough, is a proven safe technology, and they might even last. I've read articles that talk about the value of microfilms. They last longer than some like DVD material and storage discs and things like that. And they're intact if they're stored, in a safe environment, dry, cool, whatever. Photocopies put in that whole philosophical question about the original and the copy. But of course, with the photocopy, I don't know, unless you have quite a fancy machine, a photocopy is not, it's really different from the original in everyday
But you brought
life.
up another interesting dimension. This is longevity.
Yeah.
How long will this stuff still be in readable
It's a
form?
problem. It's a problem. I think you'll see in a couple of the books I see on your shelf here that longevity isn't the same now, because the viewing format for microfilm didn't change. You had a 35 millimeter film, standard sort of frame sizes, and viewing boxes that was essentially a camera in reverse, a lens. You view through a lens, standardized across the industry, and it lasts. Well, this is the problem with digital information. There are standardized raw formats, RAW, raw files, full information, but the outputs are constantly changing. And think about that even with reading on your common computer. You have the same, you can stick a file with an extension, DOC, sure, all people work with word processors, but it could have an extension WPS, or it could be, DOCX, or any number of other formats that your particular software will not read. So the whole nature of conversion and longevity, keeping things in storage that could be more volatile, protecting because it is volatile. I mean, if you unplug something, it's gone. It's not like you have a physical item anymore. So that's what has to be. I think the lesson for today is that you constantly keep as much original, fully formatted raw data where every bit and byte, all the bytes, they all match up. You shoot 2 million bytes, you keep 2 million bytes. But in some of those other formats, you're actually, like compression, you're taking a lot away and almost deceiving the psychology of your mind. Especially with sound, you're compressing for efficiency, and there are literal things that you might not hear.
One of the other issues is copyright and the loss of control, of not having that available. Because the loss of control can come from not properly registering it.
Well, luckily, or unluckily, depending on some, whatever you create today automatically becomes copyrightable. You don't have to register it. And it, by nature, it's yours, and people do still register, but you don't have to now by international agreement. Well, who signed the agreement? Well, 100 some companies signed this. Sorry, Freudian slip. Countries signed this, Berne agreement or whatever. Numbers of international, but that means that we respect the production of something from someone from another country, and vice versa. But that's
Supposedly.
convention, right? Anybody can take anything, right? Well, and we too. We do the. I mean, I think internationally, and that's why you have issues over. I mean, the issues have been compounded by the digital age, but what used to be a copy is now being, fine-tuned. Who had rights to things? The nature of parody. sampling in the musical world. Certainly, the the time-honored critiques or the time-honored sort of understanding of plagiarism in the conventional sense is there, but it's compounded now by the capabilities of being able to. I mean, you don't necessarily know where you got something. That's really dangerous, and just if you work in an academic setting, you have to honor those who wrote something or expressed something before. If you're going to borrow from it, you give credit. Sometimes, quite honestly, in this cut and paste world, you might not know where that stuff is. I mean, it can be very reckless. You have to be
one of the things that's
careful.
fascinated me is that with this expansion of the digital realm, I guess you'd call it,
Mm-hmm.
they can cross-compare books, and figure out if someone had plagiarized, because there's been some people caught up in that.
Absolutely.
Where, maybe misfired, but they had borrowed phrases from other people to a rather large extent.
Well, some well-known public historians have been, what is that called? Put their feet across the fires or whatever, called to task on some of this. And I think in some cases it's accidental. It might be, if there's blame, ultimately the writer is to blame, but many times people work for that person helping to do research. And there is a funny thing you can do in Google. You can take any paragraph. Google is a great example of this, and I suppose Yahoo and some of these other search engines could do the same, but Google has such a depth now of text that it's available. If you take 10 or 20 words that you copy from a web page or a quote of a book or something, put it into Google and put it in quotes. Take something out of your students' papers as a in the teaching context. Things will pop up. You'll be able to find those quotes not in every case, but quite easily, because more and more and more information is being digitized. Full books.
Well, in the last year or two, what I've been doing for my own research purposes and checking student papers is, if you take an author's last name in the beginning of the title and put it as a Google search, it will give you the citation information, which is kind of mind-boggling that you'd be able to do it that fast. You have to poke around a little bit in the results, but
Sure.
generally you can find it even in rather complex, arcane kinds of situations. But that also implies the breadth and depth of this digital dimension that simply didn't exist before.
That's interesting. The other thing that sort of goes along with what you're saying, and this is sort of in the book editor and accuracy realm, is that we're very trusting, especially if to the untrained person. You're very trusting of what you see online, and you shouldn't be. We all know that. Intellectually, we know that. But part of what we try to teach our students is to go through a series of mental exercises to test the accuracy of what they're looking at. And if you a citation's a perfect idea. How do you know that citation is true? In a sense, I mean, I know you and I were trained to question even what's in a bibliography of a published book. You double check what you're looking for, and you come across some interesting things, that a title isn't actually literally what you're seeing in that bibliography, and you might go through to try to track it down to its conception point, its point zero, where it was published or whatever. That's a real problem on the internet, because you'll go to a page and it'll say, okay, this is how you cite this book, just to take citations as an example. But it might not be the same format that you're supposed to. Somebody's telling you this is it.
I had a pretty funny example of that. I was checking, there was a website that was, supposed to be helping students do bibliographies, and it was plain wrong. you know, I
Yeah.
mean, or incorrect. Like it didn't show the student it had to be a hanging indent paragraph. There was just some things that
Details,
just, you know,
right.
but it was a lovely PowerPoint kind of setting, telling
Yeah.
them all this misinformation.
Yeah.
And when I teach a research writing class, I require academic sources, and newspapers, magazines, encyclopedias, particularly Wikipedia, don't work. And most online sources don't work because I tell them it's too superficial. And they're just at a loss. I mean, because they've used to using a Google search for just about everything that they're looking
Yeah,
up.
and they don't know where the sort of canonical description
No.
of how to do that particular.
And they're just amazed when I show them what a true academic source can do compared to what they have. But that's how they get most of the information, and that really is kind of scary in a way.
So don't you think some people focus a lot on... Okay, I have to say at this juncture, the content for me is what's most important. The format, meaning, what I mean is the indented paragraphs, the periods in the right place, the colons, those are all things that actually, if you understand the way the bibliographic world works, those are like mathematical formulas to people. You know that a colon is separating, say, a city with, or, you know, publisher information, all that thing, it's coded in there. But I wonder if we get a little bit too strict sometimes on being really literal with the formats, taking points off or missing a period and this
Well, they
and that.
see in my class they can just fix it.
They could,
But I
yeah.
tell them it is a code. And when
Yeah.
you do a lot of research, for students it's inconvenient and mysterious. But when you're doing a lot of research, it's an important
It's
code
important.
because it lets you identify immediately whether it's a book or an article.
Right, and then within
And-
the book world,
Yeah.
what kind of book it is in some ways.
Yeah,
you
and
know.
who published it,
Right.
and where was it
Right.
published? Those are all crucial
Yeah.
things.
And is it an edited book, or is it by
Yeah.
one author?
Because
or
the reader, an academic reader, may want to get that information, and how can they do that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I know you're right. That's part of the academic pursuit or the training you go through, because you have to understand what kind of information you're getting. It's the basics of kind of literacy, to understanding the nature of the information you're getting and what it might lead to.
Well, I ran across this book, go back to our major thing about digital files, by Anthony Seeger and Subha Chowdhury, Archives for the Future, Global Perspectives on Audiovisual Archives in the 21st Century. And there's a whole nother dimension that we haven't mentioned, and that is people who have been, I could say, victimized by the colonizers. In other words, you could have all this information posted, and it could be wrong, or be heavily biased, or inadequate. It just doesn't, there's a lot of silence on the important,
Yeah.
from the important voices in the same thing.
Right.
But one of the things about digital media is you have this preponderance, this huge amount of information, and we need to listen to the other voices, you know, and that's, unless it's a consciously developed objective, people are not going to be doing that, and
Very
they really
true.
do need to. We need to remember what else might be missing, what might have been biased, and this book is great because it emerged from a conference on ethnomusicology in India, and most of the people attending were from countries who had been victimized by
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
colonizers, and so it was fascinating to me to see the struggle to try to offset that preponderance of information, like audiovisual archives in Ghana. I know one of your interests, the music archives and their influence on the musical culture of Cuba. These are not mainstream countries, but they certainly have a valuable thing, you know, contribution to make.
Right. Right. Well, there are all kinds of ironies in this. If you look at the issue of political dominance and colonialization, returning music. I mean, this is big in terms of, you know, there's been so much pre-Columbian art, for instance, taken to the the major colonizer countries, much of it has been returned, or at least there've been now agreements, recognition that this has been the case, and there's agreements to return stelae and things like that. If you look at the audio world, there's similar things with music. Some music was, in a sense, taken away through recording, and lost to the the native locality, but now has been returned in some ways. I know the Library of Congress has a program for returning music to Native American groups and whatnot. Some of the issues here are oral traditions. The issue of an oral tradition. You mentioned Ghana. You can certainly record and keep things boxed up in a room, but the whole nature of music in that culture is an oral expressive culture where you learn from the very time you were small through a series of I mean, if you're a musician or a singer or a dancer, which almost everybody is in one way or another, not professionally, but in terms of communal society, that in a sense is the living archive. The living archive is a communal culture of expression, not the way we think of it, where we, in a sense, capture performances and things like that. And that's true across the world. It's not just Ghana. I mean, it has to do with Irish village music and things like that. The whole tradition of training and learning and apprenticeship and learning at the feet of your elders and whatnot.
What fascinated me is it takes a lot of money, a lot of resources in order to digitize something. You have to have the correct equipment, the software, you have to have a place to store it. And that benefits the people who have the financial resource to do it, not the poor people who are practicing oral culture. And also, some people went to great extents to form collections of music, and it didn't get included in the digital realm because of that expense. Well, we've come to the end of another program.
Indeed. It was great. Yeah,
thank you for being on Rip Rap again.
You're welcome. Yeah, I was glad to be here.